Borrow Time, Memoir by the co-founder of Microsoft. A week after we finished working on the PC, IBM sent us a form letter saying, "Dear vendor, you've done a fine job." However, Gary Kildall gave us a negative review. Bill and I met with him at Boeing Field, south of downtown Seattle, sometime before the August 1981 release. He'd heard rumors about our involvement with PCDOS and wanted to feel us out, and to make an appeal for the old spheres of influence. In a perfect world, Gary said, you guys should do languages, and we should do operating systems. Digital Research had recently acquired BASIC. As Gary talked, BASIC sounded like a shot across the bow. If Microsoft came up with a DOS, Kildall would open fire on us in the language business. But we were past the point where a competitor could knock us back on our heels, and certainly not in languages, where we had supreme confidence. At the time, Digital Research's software was running on hundreds of computer models. Its sales amounted to more than $5 million a year. But with 8-bit technology soon to be eclipsed and IBM secured as our 16-bit platform, Digital Research was destined to be an also-ran. Kildall did not go gently into the night. Shortly after the PC's announcement, he claimed that we'd ripped off his software. The charge wouldn't hold up, however. His program was a different animal, as anyone who'd used both the 8-bit CP/M80 and the 16-bit 86-DOS could attest. The system could read or write files up to 6 times faster. After Kildall made noise about suing for copyright infringement, a move his lawyers discouraged, IBM offered his long-delayed systems as an alternative for the PC. But it was apparent that IBM had no wish to support 2 sets of application software or revisit the chaos of the 8-bit market. It priced our DOS at $40 and competitor at $240, a premium that reflected Kildall's insistence on per-copy royalties. Once it became clear to users that IBM's software would run only on DOS, the independent software vendors ignored others and kept flocking our operating system en masse. Our relationship with IBM made MS-DOS's supremacy a fait accompli. The IBM PC was expensive and looked corporate and soulless. But it was also the best personal computer of its time, with the most powerful processor, a superior keyboard, and reliable floppy disk drives. Executives didn't wait for their IT officers to take the plunge into microcomputing. They went out, bought their PCs, and plugged them in. IBM had projected the sale of 250,000 units within 5 years, and they were off by a factor of 10. The PC marked the official close of the hobbyist era in computing, as the consumer market that we'd seeded with the Altair now came of age. Pretty much anyone who'd used an electric typewriter felt that they could handle this new class of computer. Within a few years of its release, in a development IBM had failed to anticipate, there would be dozens of PC clones, fully compatible, and generally cheaper, computers that captured most of the home market after licensing MS-DOS. Soon our operating system was bringing in more revenue than all our languages combined. By 1984, the industry had converged around a single standard, MS-DOS, twinned to the IBM specification. Thousands of applications have been created to run on top of it. Other platforms were unable to compete due to inferior hardware and limited software. The TRS-80 was extinct by 1986, the Commodore 64, and Atari ST died a few years later. Only Apple survived, carving out a premium niche in the US market that would hover around 10%. Down the road, Microsoft would suffer from the distraction of OS/2 until the company scrapped the jointly created operating system in 1990 and signaled the end of its development partnership with IBM. The PC phenomenon gave personal computers credibility in the business world. It became the launchpad for Windows and GUI applications like Word. IBM gave Microsoft an essential boost before becoming a drag that we needed to shed. Or put another way, before DOS, Microsoft was a critical software company. After DOS, it was the essential one. The poignant postscript to this story was the fall of Digital Equipment Corporation, the company we idolized in our youth. Early on, its top management had resisted the shift to personal computers. As late as 1977, its president told the World Future Association, "There is no reason anyone would want a computer in their home." 5 years later, DEC swallowed its pride and released a well-designed microcomputer. As IBM PC sales exploded, the national media noticed Microsoft, particularly Bill, as its president. He became the face of our company and the logical source for any journalist. One thing didn't change: Bill was as headstrong as ever. With Steve Ballmer on board, I was free to anchor our technical work. My management style was to wander the halls and peek in on the programmers. "What problems are slowing you down? Have you thought about trying it this way? What happens if I pull the disk out when you're doing that?" We'd talk for a few minutes as I probed, one of my strong suits. Then I'd let them solve the rest of the problem themselves. The programmers liked having one of their own in a decision-making position, and I'm sure it was a relief to report to someone with a technical background. Often I'd get valuable information about some unexpected problem. They'd be unwilling to tell Bill for fear of getting yelled at, but they felt more relaxed with me. Bill kept running big decisions by me. Our dynamic was more intertwined than the partnership at Apple, where Steve Jobs was the grand thinker and Steve Wozniak, the crack hardware designer. Bill and I were both generalists at heart. That was a significant strength for Microsoft, but it also meant that no subject escaped debate. Back in February 1980, after I'd grown convinced that we needed a more robust operating system, we licensed AT&T's Unix software and renamed it Xenix to abide by trademark restrictions. Our goal was to find a niche among mid-size companies that wanted a heavier-duty system than MS-DOS without paying for a mini-computer or using a time-sharing service. But while Xenix made some money for Microsoft, it fell short of expectations. Even a scaled-down version of Unix was too demanding for the 8086 chip, and there were financial issues, too. AT&T was unwilling to lower its license fees for high-volume sales, so their royalties cut deeply into our profit margin. Microsoft wound up selling its interest in the software a few years later. Xenix was still on my mind in the spring of 1982 when IBM asked us for a next-generation DOS that could manage the upcoming PC-XT and its 10-megabyte hard disk drive, a vast amount of storage at the time. Our goal was to bring several best-of-breed Unix features into the PC and widen our edge over Digital Research and Apple, whose operating systems were less sophisticated. If we did the job right, it would bolster MS-DOS as the industry standard. After brainstorming for days on possible improvements, we settled on two major ones. The first was Mark's idea for loadable device drivers, which would allow PC users to add third-party printers or external hard drives without soaking up too much memory, the first step toward today's plug-and-play. Second, and more importantly, we were devising a new way to organize files. If our new DOS was too memory-hungry, IBM feared that smaller PC systems would run out of room for some popular applications. And they weren't accustomed to contractors going beyond their specs, even if it meant they were getting more for their money. IBM's developers loved our 20 extra features, but management thought we were cramming in arbitrary changes. They weren't pleased that DOS 2.0 was now triple the size of DOS 1.1 or that interim deadlines had slipped. Jobs invited Bill and me down to see a Macintosh trial run. Jobs was disgusted when the display locked up after booting. Jobs comes off as a charismatic but ruthless and mean-spirited jerk in the film Pirates of Silicon Valley. Apple unsuccessfully sued Microsoft for copyright infringement over Windows GUI. Bill Gates' excesses, for good or ill, were spontaneous. CEO could be callous and rude, but he had a warmer, human side, too. Bill stopped seeking me out on a regular basis, and I went in to see him less and less. I can no longer tolerate the browbeating or tirades that characterize almost every attempt I make to discuss any controversial subject. The camaraderie of the early days is long since gone, writes Steve Jobs in a letter to his former boss, Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates.